All right, what's up, y'all? It's Wooly here. So I want to talk about what I think is the hardest role in the game, and it's probably not what you think I'm going to say. Okay, so at first thought, when I say what is the hardest role in the game, you're probably going to say tank, and I'm going to disagree. I'm going to tell you why. Now, being the most important role is undoubtedly the tank, but being the most important role does not necessarily mean it's the hardest role. Yes, the tank is necessary in 90% of the time. Like, you can probably get by in omnibus without a tank. But when you go into elite plus, things like that, of course, you need a tank. It's just a make or break, and the tank controls the flow of the raid. The tank usually is in charge of the callouts. Like, nobody's going to argue that the tank role is tough at times, and often it's a pretty thankless role. Nobody's going to thank you for being a tank because, hey, you're a tank, you chose that role. It's just expected that you're going to know what to do. So when the tank is good, people are going to say, hey, that's a good tank. But that's pretty much all they're going to say. Um, Being a healer, now, nobody's really looking at you and saying, "Oh, you did so much healing out." You're keeping them alive. That's your primary goal as a healer. Obviously, some healers are better than others. That's the same with any role, right? And then, of course, if you're dropping extra stuff like Philosopher's Stone as a healer, well, you're doing the good work out there, and we appreciate it. But nobody's really going out of their way to say, "Damn, that healer's OP." You know what I mean? And then controller, I would say controller is probably one of the other thankless roles in the fact that controllers do a lot of work, right? They do everything. They're expected to deal a decent amount of damage. They're expected to debuff. They're expected to give power back. They're expected to buff the stats of the DPS, whether that's smite or prec or both. Because when you get into controller role, you get a little more advanced there because now you're expected to be swapping multiple arts. In your support role, it's not the same as a tank or a heal. As a heal, you might be expected to swap EOG for that 10k, but as a controller, you're expected to swap at least several artifacts. So it is a still an easy role to play, but it can be a tougher role when you choose to jump into the higher content as that support role. People expect you to have a fair amount of SP and a fair amount of artifacts to support that role, to support them. So I would say Troll is the second hardest role to play, but not necessarily the hardest. So that leaves us with one additional role, DPS. And you may be rolling your eyes. You may be jumping into the comments already and being like, DPS is the easiest role, bro. That's cap. But, hear me out. Okay. I can understand where you're coming from. But listen, I've played every role in this game. I've been in this game for years. I've done it all. I've done controller. I started out as a troll. I've done tank. I've done healer on almost every power minus atomic. Okay. I would say DPS is the hardest role to play. And hear me out. Okay. I've got some reasoning behind this. And again, this is just my opinion, but this is the opinion of a longtime player. I don't think DPS gets enough love because there's just so many of them. But that doesn't mean there's a lot of good DPS out there. Now, I know a lot of good DPS and I know a lot of great DPS, and you can definitely tell the difference when you get in there with a great DPS compared to a average, decent, or a good DPS. You can definitely tell the difference. Okay? And I want to explain to you why. So just hear me out. This is why I think DPS is the hardest role in the game to play. And this is a conversation we had in Discord earlier when we were just shooting the shit and just, just talking a little bit. Let me move so I don't go away here. Why do I think DPS is the hardest role to play? And it's not just because I main DPS. The reason I think DPS is the hardest role to play is because it is the only role in the game that is constantly under scrutiny. Because people will give a tank a chance. They will give a heal a chance. They will give a troll a chance. A troll probably more than any other role because there's more healers out there than there are trolls. Tanks, not as much, but you can probably find a tank before you can find a troll. And as long as your heal is pretty good, the tank may be able to pull through. As long as your troll is decent, they're going to get carried. Or they're going to carry, right? One or the other. But even if the troll is not that good, you can get by just doing debuffs and pumping out some power with minimal buffs. Okay. But a DPS, on the other hand, not so much. Because if the DPS is decent, if the DPS messes up, they're getting kicked. It's not the same as being a heal or a tank or a troll where it feels like that role is a little more necessary. You're getting kicked as a DPS. I'm sorry, that's just the way it goes. If you're trash, you're trash. You're getting kicked out of the group. Not so much if you're a tank or a heal. Possibly a heal, you're going to get kicked. But with a troll, they'll at least give you a couple of shots to get it together. But as a DPS, you're gone automatically. If you're dealing with a group that knows what they're doing, you're out. There's no chance, right? And so a DPS is constantly under scrutiny when it comes to just performing, because it's not just about doing damage, right? If you're a good DPS, you're not just doing DPS. Like, here's the thing. A lot of people talk about board chasers, scoreboard chasers, DPS that are only worried about the scoreboards and they're not doing the mechs. Well, it's a DPS's job to deal damage. The same way it's a healer's job to heal, it's a tank's job to tank, it's a troll's job to, get out there and troll and do all of the above, debuff, pick up, do mechs, swap arts. That's expected of a troll. The thing with DPS is it's the same thing as a troll. You're expected to get out there, deal damage, pick up, do mechs, swap multiple artifacts, while also putting numbers on the board and being the highest that there is. So as a DPS, you're constantly under scrutiny. You're constantly under a microscope. You are always being compared to everybody else. You're constantly being compared to everybody else in the group, to every other DPS out there. So when you're in a raid of 8 people, there's one tank, there's one heal, there's one troll. There's nobody else to compete against, right? But as a DPS, there's several people to compete against. Now you're expected to do all of those things while also keeping yourself alive, getting out of the way of those mechanics, blocking those one shots, taking charge of those mechanics without anybody telling you to, picking up people that go down because they're not doing the mechanics, swapping your artifacts, and also putting good numbers up on the board. And so there's a lot that goes into being a great DPS. I'm not just talking about being just a good DPS and being a great DPS. Now, I know if you followed my channel, then you know how I play. You know that I do a lot of artifact swapping. And it can be pretty intense when you're in the heat of the moment and you've got those mechanics going off and you're trying to swap artifacts, and sometimes that gets you wiped, and that's just what it is. And no matter how good you are, no matter how many skill points you got, no matter how many artifacts you swap, no matter if you're precision, no matter if you're might, there's always going to be somebody that's going to wash you out on the board at one point or another, right? Um, and that's just the way it is. But it's the only role in the game that you were constantly being judged upon, right? Because you can jump into a raid as a tank, as a heal, and a troll, and you can perform adequately. And if you just suck that day, then you just suck. And people can be like, "Oh, you're trash," and that's it. They're not they're not really gonna think anything else of it. But if you're a DPS, they're gonna give you a hard time. They're gonna give you shit about being a bad DPS. You'll never hear the end of it, right? So I personally feel that DPS is the hardest role in the game. Some people may disagree with that because they say, "Oh, it's the most common," but just because a role is common doesn't mean it's an easy role to play. Not everybody can be a DPS. Some people aren't built for it. You can easily put on some gear, put on some artifacts, and go out there and look up a YouTube video and do what they're doing, but you're not exactly doing what they're doing. Like, I show you guys my builds, right? I'll show you my AoE build, my single target build, and stuff like that. And I say, run it like this or run it like that. But there's times in the heat of the moment where you need to kind of adjust how you're running that loadout, right? Like when I'm doing AoE and I know I need to stack dots, but sometimes it's not appropriate to stack those dots because we're coming close to the end of that ad phase, or we're coming close to the end of that group of ads where my dot is off cooldown and it's ready to go. But it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to pop that when I can just pop a quick burst damage in place of that because I don't need the dot at that time, because it's going to cost me damage to pop that dot as opposed to just popping my quick burst damage, right? And so those are things you need to consider as a DPS, and that's a lot of stuff that people don't consider, what a DPS has to put up with and what they have to actually achieve. So people think of DPS and think, "Oh, well, they're just inabundant. We can get another one." Yeah, you can get another DPS, but it's 1 out of 10 that you're going to get a quality DPS, right? And so this is why I say DPS is the hardest role to play, is because it doesn't get enough love, it doesn't get enough recognition, and you're expected to do everything else that every other role is doing times 10 and still put up good numbers. Because even if you are doing everything that you're supposed to be doing in the raid, right? You're doing all the mechanics, you're picking people up, you're just a good player in general, you're observant, you're competent, you're helping the team get through it, but your damage is trash, they're probably not going to bring you back because you're not really living up to your role. And so that's why I say, in my eyes, DPS is the hardest role to play. Yeah, so it's just something I wanted to talk about. It's a video, it's content. This is just for fun. Don't get offended. If you are getting offended, get better at the game. That's all I gotta say. But personally, I think DPS is the hardest role to play, and I'm always looking for quality DPS more than I am a tank, a troll, or a heal. I will add those to my friends list before I add any other role, because it's easy enough to find any role. I know these days it's a little bit tougher, but finding a good DPS is few and far between, no matter how many of them are out there. I already know plenty of them, but still, it's not as easy as you think to find a quality DPS that can do everything that is required and still be a good DPS. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'm sure you will. You always do. Whether or not I ask for it. But that's okay. I don't mind it at all. I appreciate it, guys. So if you're new to the channel, consider sticking around. And if you've been with me, I appreciate it. We're almost to the 1,000. So that's kind of the point of this video. It's just to drive some content. This is nothing serious. But hey, it is what it is, guys. I'll catch you next time. Willie out. Stay frosty. Peace.